Oregon morning air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine needles and wet earth. For Elias Thorne, this was the smell of peace, a quiet reward at the end of a long road that had led him far from home and back again. In his late 30s, his face was lean and marked by lines that spoke more of vigilance than of age. His dark hair cut short in a way that had outlasted his military service. He moved with a practiced economy, his steps making little sound on the worn floorboards of the farmhouse his great-grandfather had built over a century ago. His only true companion in this chosen solitude was Kaiser, a 5-year-old German shepherd, whose magnificent coat of silver, gray, and white was a stark, living contrast to the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. The dog was his shadow, a silent presence of unwavering loyalty that had done more to heal the unseen wounds of war than any doctor could. Their routine was the anchor of his life, a simple rhythm of chores and quiet companionship that kept the louder parts of the world at bay. But for the past 3 days, that rhythm had been broken. The peace had been fractured by a sound that now grated on Elias's nerves from dawn until dusk. The frantic, persistent scraping of claws against soil and root. Kaiser was digging. He was not digging with the playful abandon of a dog burying a bone, but with a desperate, obsessive intensity that had transformed him. He had chosen a single spot on the property, a patch of earth at the base of a colossal oak tree whose branches had shaded 4 generations of thorns. The digging was relentless. Elias had tried everything. He had used his sternest command voice, a tone that had once made younger soldiers stand straighter, but Kaiser seemed deaf to it. He had tried luring him away with a piece of smoked bacon, the dog's greatest weakness, but Kaiser had ignored it, his eyes fixed on the hole. He had even tried physically leading him to the other side of the property and securing him on a lead, only for the dog to whine and pull with a heartbreaking urgency until Elias couldn't stand it anymore. This morning, Elias stood by the porch railing, a ceramic mug of coffee growing cold in his hand, and watched. The hole was now deep enough to swallow the dog's head and shoulders. Clumps of dark, rich earth were flung backwards, staining the pristine gray fur on Kaiser's chest and legs. The dog's powerful paws, normally so immaculate, were caked with mud and, Elias suspected, worn raw. He worked with a methodical fury, pausing only to push dirt aside with his snout, or to let out a low, guttural bark that was entirely alien. It was not a bark of aggression or excitement, but a sound of pure, raw frustration, of a creature trying to communicate something vital that was just beyond his grasp. The other animals on the small farm felt it too. The few chickens he kept were silent, and the old horse in the far pasture stood with his head raised, watching the scene under the oak tree with an unnerving stillness. Putting his mug down, Elias walked across the damp grass, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. "Kaiser, enough," he said, his voice softer this time, laced with a concern that was beginning to outweigh his frustration. The dog stopped for a moment, his head emerging from the hole. His intelligent brown eyes, usually so calm and clear, were wild with a strange light. He panted heavily, his breath misting in the cool air, and a long string of drool hung from his jaw. He looked at Elias, and in that gaze, Elias saw not defiance, but a desperate plea. Kaiser let out another one of those guttural whines, then looked from Elias back to the hole, as if to say, "You have to see. You have to understand." Elias knelt, his knee pressing into the cold, damp earth. He looked into the growing cavity. There was nothing there but dirt, tangled roots, and the occasional stone. But the air around it felt different, heavy with a tension that had no logical source. Kaiser was not just digging. He was trying to uncover something that had unsettled the very ground beneath their feet, something that had disturbed his loyal friend so deeply that he would not eat or rest. Elias reached out and placed a hand on the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. "All right, boy," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "What is it? What are you trying to show me?" The unspoken question hung in the air between man and dog. Elias looked from Kaiser's pleading eyes to the disturbed earth and felt a grim resolve settle in his stomach. This was his land, his family's history, and whatever secret lay buried here, he could no longer ignore it. He gave Kaiser's head one last, firm pat before standing up and walking with purpose toward the old, weathered barn that leaned tiredly near the woods. The barn smelled of hay, dust, and time itself. From a row of well-worn tools hanging on the wall, he selected a sturdy shovel, its wooden handle smooth from the hands of his father and grandfather before him. As he walked back toward the ancient oak, Kaiser trotted silently at his side, the frantic energy gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful vigilance. The dog had done his part. Now it was Elias's turn. He drove the shovel's blade into the soil at the bottom of the hole Kaiser had started. The digging was hard work. The ground was a stubborn web of thick roots and compacted, clay-like soil. But with each shovelful he tossed aside, Elias felt a growing sense of anticipation, a feeling that he was getting closer to an answer he wasn't sure he wanted. Kaiser sat patiently now, just beyond the edge of the expanding hole, his posture tense, his gaze never leaving the shovel. After 10 minutes of steady digging, the shovel's metal head struck something that was not a rock or a root. It made a soft, muffled sound, and the blade met a strange, yielding resistance. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped to his knees, laying the shovel aside, and began to dig carefully with his bare hands. His fingers brushed against a coarse, buried texture. He worked the soil away and pulled free a small, tattered piece of fabric. It was a heavy, dark blue wool, the kind used in old uniforms, faded by time and earth but miraculously intact. A cold dread began to seep into Elias's bones. This was not an animal someone had buried. He took a deep breath and resumed digging with renewed urgency. A few inches deeper, the tips of his fingers grazed something hard, smooth, and unnervingly cylindrical. He recoiled for a second before forcing himself to continue. He cleared the dirt around the object, his hands shaking slightly, and uncovered the unmistakable, bleached white shape of a human bone. A femur. The air left his lungs in a rush. He sat back on his heels, the world narrowing to the dark hole, and the testament to a life that had ended there. Kaiser let out a low whine, as if sensing his owner's shock, and nudged Elias's arm with his wet nose. The touch broke his paralysis. With a grim sense of duty, Elias continued his work, no longer just digging, but performing a solemn excavation. Soon, he had uncovered more: the curved shape of a rib cage, the delicate bones of a hand, and then, nestled within the ribs, something metallic caught a stray glint of sunlight. He carefully pried it from the dirt. It was a 5-pointed star, tarnished and green with age, but its form was undeniable. He turned it over in his palm, his thumb rubbing away the grime. Faintly engraved in the metal were the words U.S. Marshal and a name, Samuel Reed. The walk back to the house was a blur. He left the grave untouched, a sacred and terrible sight now, but he carried the Marshal's star with him. Inside, the familiar quiet of his home felt heavy, suffocating. He sat at his kitchen table and opened his laptop. The cool metal of the star, a chilling weight in his hand. His fingers, still dirty from the earth, felt clumsy on the keyboard as he typed in the name. Samuel Reed, U.S. Marshal. Disappeared Oregon. The search results loaded with an awful speed. He clicked on a link to a digitized archive of a 1,923 county newspaper. The headline was stark: Federal Marshal vanishes during investigation. He read the brittle, yellowed text on the screen, his blood turning to ice. Marshal Samuel Reed had disappeared in the autumn of that year. He was investigating a series of violent disputes in the territory, and was last seen heading into the remote foothills to question local homesteaders. The article listed the prominent families in the area he was meant to visit. The last name on the list was Thorne. Elias stared at the screen, his mind struggling to connect the dots. He thought of the stories his father used to tell about his great-grandfather, Jedediah Thorne, the patriarch who had carved this farm from the wilderness with grit and honor. Jedediah was a local legend, a man respected for his integrity and hard work. But as Elias looked from the name on the screen to the tarnished star on his table, a horrifying new history began to write itself in his mind. The timeline, the location, the body buried on his family's land. It all pointed to one soul-crushing conclusion. The hero of his family's story, the man whose legacy he lived in, might have been a killer. Hours bled into one another as Elias sat motionless at his kitchen table, the house shrouded in a profound darkness that mirrored the abyss that had opened in his soul. The single bare bulb overhead cast a harsh glare on the tarnished Marshall's star and the laptop screen, which still displayed the ghost of a 100-year-old newspaper. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on him. His entire life, he had been sustained by the legacy of his family, the quiet pride of being a Thorne, a name synonymous with integrity and hard work. Now, that legacy was a lie, a carefully constructed story built upon a foundation of violence and deceit. A cold, pragmatic voice whispered in his mind, offering an easy way out. Put the star back. Fill the hole. No one knows. No one ever has to know. He could restore the peace. He could rake the earth smooth, plant new grass over the spot, and in a year, it would be as if nothing had ever happened. He could keep his quiet life, his solitude, his fractured peace. All it would cost was his conscience. He was staring into the tarnished metal of the star, lost in his dark thoughts, when a wet nose pressed firmly into his idle hand. Elias flinched, startled from his trance. Kaiser was standing beside him, his head cocked, his intelligent eyes filled with a deep, knowing concern. The dog had been lying silently on the floor, but he had not been sleeping. He had been watching his master, sensing the descent into despair. Kaiser whined softly, a sound that cut through the oppressive silence, and nudged Elias's hand again, this time with more insistence. When Elias didn't move, the dog walked to the back door, looked back at him, and let out a single low bark. It was a clear summons. Get up! Move! Don't stay here! The simple, honest command of his only friend was the one thing that could have reached him. Slowly, stiffly, Elias pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. With a sense of weary resignation, he followed. Kaiser led him out into the moonlit night, bypassing the large, main barn and heading instead toward a smaller, more ancient structure, nearly reclaimed by the forest's edge. It was the original cabin that Jedediah Thorne had first built, a simple, one-room dwelling of hand-hewn logs that now served as a dusty tomb for forgotten tools and broken furniture. The air inside was thick with the smell of decaying wood and rust. Moonlight slanted through a grimy window, illuminating swirling dust motes. Kaiser paid no mind to the clutter. He went directly to a corner of the cabin and began to paw at the floorboards, his claws making a dry, scratching sound. He sniffed intently at one particular board, a plank of old-growth fir that was slightly warped, its edge sitting a fraction of an inch higher than the rest. He looked back at Elias, his message unmistakable. Here, the secret isn't finished. A new feeling, a flicker of adrenaline, cut through Elias's despair. He found an old crowbar leaning against the wall, its iron cool and heavy in his hand. He forced the hooked end into the gap and pulled. With a loud groan of protesting nails, the board splintered and came free. In the hollow space beneath, shielded from the damp and the dust, sat a small, black iron box. It was heavy, sealed by a century of rust. Elias lifted it out and carried it back to the house as if it were a bomb. He placed it on the kitchen table, a dark companion to the silver star. It took him several minutes with a hammer and a screwdriver to break the rusted lock. The screech of metal on metal, setting his teeth on edge. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cloth, lay a single leather-bound journal. With a hand that was not entirely steady, Elias lifted it out and opened it. The pages were filled with the tight, slanted script of his great-grandfather. For an hour, he read, his initial dread turning to a cold certainty. The journal was a meticulous record of a thriving bootlegging operation, with coded entries about shipments of whiskey, profit shares, and the names of local partners. Then, he found the entry he was searching for, dated in the late fall of 1923. The words were not those of a man confessing a sin, but of a businessman solving a problem. The marshal's inquiries have become a liability. His persistence threatens the entire enterprise. Met with him today under the oak. The matter is now settled, permanently. Our future is secure. Elias closed the journal. The words, so cold, so final, had extinguished the last ember of his doubt. This was not a tragic misunderstanding. It was a calculated execution for the sake of profit. The despair in his chest had not vanished, but it had been forged by the cold fire of the truth into something new, something hard and unbending. It was resolve. He looked from the journal in his hand to the marshal's star on the table. A good man had died here, a man trying to do his duty, and his family had prospered from it. Elias Thorne now had a duty of his own. He would not rebury the truth. He would be the one to finally bring it into the light. The first light of dawn found Elias not in his bed, but at the kitchen table, a fortress of evidence built around him. The night had passed without sleep, fueled by black coffee and the cold fire of his new purpose. His military training, long dormant, had taken over. This was a mission now, and the first step was reconnaissance. With meticulous care, he used his phone to photograph every single page of Jedediah Thorne's journal. He created a separate, password-protected file on his laptop and began the painstaking work of transcribing the faded script, cross-referencing every name and initial with online county archives and historical records. He was no longer just the descendant of a criminal wrestling with shame. He was an investigator, piecing together the anatomy of a conspiracy that had poisoned his family's land for a century. The work was slow and grim, but with each connection he made, the fog of the past began to clear, revealing the stark and ugly truth beneath. One name appeared more frequently than any other, often linked with notes about distribution and payments. Callahan. Elias felt a prickle of unease. The name was as old and established in the county as his own. A quick search of the town's present-day leadership confirmed his fear. The results spread across his screen like a spider's web. The current county sheriff was Raymond Callahan. One of the 3 county judges was Marcus Callahan. The largest real estate agency in town, the one that handled nearly every major land deal, was Callahan Properties. It was not just a family. It was a dynasty, a network of power with roots sunk deep into the very soil of the county. The realization struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. Marshal Samuel Reed had not been murdered by a lone, greedy man. He had been silenced by a partnership, a criminal enterprise whose illicit profits had been laundered through time, legitimized, and passed down through the generations. The men who ran this town today were the direct beneficiaries of that century-old crime. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of an engine broke the morning silence, a vehicle coming slowly up his long gravel driveway. Elias moved to the window. It was a county sheriff's patrol car. He felt his muscles tense. Kaiser, who had been dozing near the hearth, lifted his head, a low rumble beginning deep in his chest. Elias placed a calming hand on his dog's back as he watched a man get out of the car. He was in his mid-50s, with a thick build that had gone soft around the middle, and a friendly, practiced smile. It was Sheriff Raymond Callahan. Elias met him on the porch, positioning himself so the door was at his back. Kaiser stood beside him, silent now, but rigid with suspicion. His intelligent eyes locked on the visitor. "Morning, Elias," the sheriff said, his voice a smooth, neighborly baritone. "Just making the rounds. It's a small town, you know. Word gets around." He paused, letting his gaze drift pointedly toward the ancient oak tree in the distance. "Heard you've been doing a little digging into your family's history." The friendly tone didn't quite match the cold calculation in his eyes. "That's a fine thing, respecting your heritage. But some old stories are best left in the past. Sometimes, when you dig things up, they can make a real mess. For everyone." The threat, wrapped in a folksy warning, was unmistakable. Elias kept his face impassive, his gaze steady. "Just trying to understand where I come from, Sheriff." Kaiser's low growl resumed, a clear, unambiguous warning that vibrated through the porch floorboards. Callahan's smile tightened at the sound. He glanced at the dog with a flicker of annoyance before turning back to Elias. "Well, you be careful what you go looking for," he said, his voice losing some of its warmth. "You have a good day now." The visit left an unnerving chill in the air long after the patrol car had disappeared down the driveway. The danger was no longer an abstract concept tied to a rusted star and a moldering journal. It was real. It had a name, and it had just been on his porch. Throughout the rest of the day, Elias felt a constant, prickling sense of being watched. Twice, he saw the sheriff's car driving slowly along the public road that bordered his property. Its pace too slow to be a routine patrol. He was a prisoner in his own home. The long sightlines of his fields no longer a comfort but a vulnerability. As evening fell, he stood by the window, looking out into the encroaching darkness. Kaiser took up his position beside him, a silent, loyal sentinel. Elias understood now. The ghosts of 1923 were very much alive, and they were wearing uniforms and judges' robes. This was no longer just about finding justice for a dead man. It was about surviving the men who would do anything to keep him silent. The feeling of being watched did not fade with the daylight. It intensified, coiling in the shadows that grew long across the fields. Elias Thorne knew they would be back. The warning from Sheriff Callahan had not been a suggestion. It had been a promise. But Elias was no longer the man who had retreated from the world. The military had taught him that when you are outgunned, you change the battlefield. That night, under the stark light of his kitchen, he made his final move. He carefully compiled everything into a single, comprehensive package. On a small USB drive, he saved the high-resolution photographs of every page of Jedediah's journal. He wrote a detailed chronological statement of his own, from Kaiser's first day of digging to Callahan's veiled threats on his porch. He included a clear photo of Marshall Reed's tarnished star. He sealed the drive and his statement in a padded envelope, and just before midnight, he and Kaiser drove into the next town over, to a 24-hour shipping depot. He paid in cash and sent the package via express courier to the FBI field office in Portland. The clerk who took the package, a sleepy young man, had no idea he was handling the key to a century of injustice. Driving home, Elias felt a strange sense of calm. The trap was set. He didn't have to wait long. The following evening, as dusk settled over the valley, a dark, heavy-duty truck with no markings rumbled up his driveway, its headlights cutting through the gloom. 3 men got out. Sheriff Callahan was in the lead, no longer wearing his uniform or his politician's smile. Flanking him were 2 large deputies, whose faces were grim and purposeful. This was not a visit. It was an eradication. Elias waited for them on the porch, the old wood solid beneath his feet. He was not afraid. As the men approached the steps, Kaiser moved to stand in front of him. The dog did not bark. The sound he made was far more terrifying. a low, guttural growl that was the sound of pure, protective fury. His lips were curled back, revealing a formidable set of teeth, and the fur along his spine stood up like a ragged silver mane. He was an immovable wall of loyalty. "This ends tonight, Thorn," Callahan said, his voice flat and cold. "You should have let it go." He and his men fanned out, looking for a way around the snarling German shepherd. But just as one of the deputies took a hesitant step forward, the night exploded. The piercing wail of sirens ripped through the quiet air, and the darkness was suddenly, violently alive with flashing red and blue lights. A convoy of black, unmarked cars swarmed the driveway, pinning Callahan's truck. Doors flew open and a team of federal agents in tactical vests emerged, their weapons drawn and held with expert stillness. A woman in a dark suit, her face calm and all business, stepped forward. "Raymond Callahan," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You and your men are under arrest. Drop your weapons." Callahan froze, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as he realized he had walked into a trap far more sophisticated than the one he had planned. In moments, the clicks of handcuffs locking into place echoed in the night. A sound of finality, a sound of justice, a century delayed, but not denied. A year later, the Thorn farm was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of isolation, but of true peace. The scandal of the Callahan conspiracy, as the papers called it, had shaken the state, a sprawling story of corruption and murder that had all started with one dog's refusal to let a secret lie. The guilty had been convicted, their stolen legacies dismantled. Elias, though he remained a private man, no longer felt like a ghost on his own land. The ground beneath his feet felt clean, under the mighty branches of the ancient oak tree where Kaiser had first started digging. There now stood a simple, dignified marker of gray granite. It read, "Marshal Samuel Reed, a man of duty, at rest at last." Kaiser often lay near the stone, dozing in the sun, a gentle, peaceful companion once more. His frantic work was done, the troubled spirit in the earth finally calm. Elias looked at the memorial, then at his loyal friend, and understood the true meaning of honor. It was not found in a perfect, unblemished past, but in the courage to face an imperfect one and fight for what is right. He had learned that some truths are too important to stay buried, and that justice, no matter how long it takes, deserves a voice. And sometimes, that voice comes in the form of a loyal friend who simply refuses to stop digging. If this story of how one animal's loyalty brought a century of injustice to light has moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of the incredible bond between humans and animals.